It's a stunning, eerie, otherworldly landscape. Icebergs float out to sea from some of the largest glaciers and ice caps on the planet, while vast lava fields could make a traveler think they've landed on the surface of the moon. Tall mountain peaks plunge thousands of feet into the sea, leaving spectacular fjords to slice deep into the island, while waterfall after waterfall carries snowmelt from the mountains to the ocean. Hundreds of thousands of sheep roam a countryside where in many places you can travel far before encountering any sign of another human being. Tiny fishing villages dot its sparsely populated coastline, while the majority of its population lives side by side in one of the most remote major cities on the planet. Even today, life in Iceland is always changing. Land is born and lost in a fiery, eternal cycle. The evacuation of one of the country's largest towns with the birth of a new volcano is a reminder that here, in one of the last parts of the planet to be settled by humans, nature rules, and always has. Iceland is a country that is remote, stunning, and fascinating, and it's grown into a major tourist destination. But my goal here is not to provide you with a tourist itinerary. If you've watched my channel, you know I'm not a travel or lifestyle influencer. Neither will this be a hastily thrown together video essay that anyone with internet access could come up with. There's no shortage of either of these types of videos out there. I want this channel to serve, as one viewer put it, as a definitive work, to learn and then teach as much as I can of a place's geography, history, society, and culture, to tell as much of the whole story as is possible. So I went to Iceland to meet its people, learn its history, and spend time in its cities, towns, countryside, and wilderness. My brother Quinn and I drove nearly 1,200 miles or 2,000 kilometers around the island, and much, though not all, of the footage you see in this video, including the thumbnail, was filmed by us on site. This project has been a year in the making. I hope you enjoy it. Back when I was just 7 years old, I discovered what would become a lifelong passion of mine: tracing my genealogy. I would sit down and leaf through old records and files, call my family members and ask questions, visit old grave sites, and build a family tree, managing to uncover generations and generations of my ancestors. Through this channel, I love to tell stories, explore the history of the country and the world, like my video diving into the major ancestry groups that make up the United States. Genealogy is just that, a tapestry of stories, woven together, tales of people with different lives and experiences, speaking different languages, calling different places home, all leading up to your own story. If you, like me, love geography and history, then I imagine that you will also love to trace the history of your own family. This video is sponsored by MyHeritage. The best and easiest way to start on the exciting journey of learning the story of your ancestors is with MyHeritage. I was particularly excited to partner with MyHeritage because I've personally used them before when building my own family tree. Even if you have a pretty strong background in genealogy already, like I did, because MyHeritage has over 19 billion historical records available for you to use, I was able to find out a ton about my ancestors that honestly really surprised me and has made me want to learn more. I found out that some of my French-Canadian ancestors were descended from Portuguese immigrants to colonial Quebec. I discovered that some of my Polish family came to the United States from what's modern-day Ukraine, and I learned of an English ancestor who died deep in the jungles of French Guiana. I've learned so much more about my own family thanks to MyHeritage, and I have so many new questions that I want to keep exploring and trying to learn the answers to. If you're just getting started delving in your family history, MyHeritage makes it really easy. Their Instant Discoveries feature allows you to cross-check your tree with others and add entire branches at the click of a button, and their AI tools allow you to easily repair, enhance, and colorize old family photos. If you want to learn about your family history but don't know where to start, or want to further an already existing passion, MyHeritage will be perfect for you. Sign up for a 14-day free trial and enjoy all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer using the link below or by scanning the QR code on the screen. My brother Quinn has been working on a project of his own, documenting our travels on the island, and we're going to try to release both videos around the same time. Go check his video out and give him a subscription at his channel, Quinn the Cameraman. He's a great filmmaker and spent a lot of time editing this video as well, so I'd love it if you go show him some support. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host Carter. This is The Nation Explained, a deep dive into a land, its people, and their past, present, and future. Episode 3, Iceland. As with all my videos, I take pronunciations very seriously. Icelandic words are notoriously some of the most difficult for English speakers to pronounce. So if I thought Greenlandic was hard, well, I was really in for a treat with Icelandic. Needless to say, it won't be perfect, but as with my last Nation Explained video on Greenland, I will be trying my best. I want to give a huge thank you to Icelandic fan of the channel Haukur, who helped me with each and every Icelandic pronunciation in this video, and without whose help this would not have been possible. You'll hear from him later on as well, talking about life on the island. With that, let's get started. According to the Köppen climate classification, Iceland is split mostly between two different climate zones. Most of the island has a tundra climate, the same as the coast of Greenland. Tundra climates can occasionally be warm in the summer, but have temperatures below freezing for most of the year. Weather so cold that soil freezes beneath the surface, and what's known as permafrost. Because of this, tundra biomes usually have very few trees, and the volcanic highland that occupies much of the country's interior is rocky and devoid of soil. Large forests did once stretch across Iceland's valleys and lower-lying coastal regions, but were quickly deforested by Viking settlers soon after their arrival. Though efforts to reforest the island are underway, today it has one of the lowest proportions of tree cover of any country on the planet, at just 0.51%. For comparison, this is barely more than Saudi Arabia, where trees are estimated to cover about 0.45% of the desert country. Overgrazing of sheep, which outnumber people on the island by more than 2-to-1 margin, have kept tree cover low. A silver lining to the island's deforestation problem, practically anywhere you go, you'll be met by sweeping views as far as the eye can see. Coastal parts of the island in the south and west, roughly stretching from the Bay of Breiðafjörður in the north to the glacier of Vatnajökull in the southeast, are part of the warmer subpolar oceanic climate zone, with long but milder winters, a climate type found in the Scottish Highlands, Norway's county of Nordland, and a stretch of the Pacific coast of North America, including British Columbia's Vancouver Island, the Haida Gwaii archipelago, and the Alaska Panhandle. A few pockets of land in the north of Iceland are part of this warmer climate zone as well, notably the valley of Eyjafjarðardalur, which feeds the valley of Eyjafjörður and is home to Iceland's second largest urban area, Akureyri. Unsurprisingly, practically all of the country's population lives in this climate zone, either in cities like Reykjavik or fishing villages on the coast. Few towns are located inland, and if so, they aren't far from the ocean. Selfoss, for example, Iceland's largest inland town, is only 6 miles or 10 kilometers from the Atlantic. Urbanization on the island only really began in full force in the very late 1800s, and revolved around the fishing industry, so cities naturally tended to develop around the coast. The warmer climate in the south and west is thanks to the North Atlantic Current, which carries warm Gulf Stream waters from the Gulf of Mexico far into the North Atlantic, bringing mild temperatures to much of Europe, and giving the continent a warmer climate further north than in North America, and giving the southern and western coasts significantly more precipitation than the north and east. You might expect Madrid, with its warm southern European temperatures and year-round sun, is at a similar distance from the equator to Florida or Southern California, but it's as far north as New York or Philadelphia. Paris sits at the same latitude as the far northern tip of Minnesota. London is further north than any major Canadian city besides Edmonton, and Copenhagen is as far north as parts of Alaska and the Hudson Bay. Granted, Iceland's population is very small compared to other countries of its size, but considering how far north it is, the fact that the island is home to as many as 372,000 people is testament to the Gulf Stream's incredible impact. Iceland's southernmost point, not far from the town of Vik, sits further north than much of southern Greenland, as well as the Canadian territories of Yukon, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories. These 4 vast Arctic regions, which sit at the same latitude and collectively encompass a land area 59 times the size of Iceland, are together home to less than half its population. The major exception is Alaska, but most of the state's population is further south than Iceland. The island's southern tip sits further north than Anchorage and even Denali National Park. The parts of Alaska north of Iceland's southernmost tip are home to only 145,000 people, less than 40% of Iceland's population. Reykjavik is the northernmost capital of any independent country in the world, and sits at an identical latitude to Nuuk, Greenland. Its seat of government is just slightly further to the south. Most of the island is just south of the Arctic Circle. Only the northern tip of the peninsula known as Vestfjordur, or the West Fjords, the northeastern peninsulas of Melrakkaslétta and Langanes, and the island of Grimsey sit within the Arctic Circle. So far to the north, the island experiences the phenomenon of the midnight sun in the summer, with the sun staying up throughout the night, barely dipping below the horizon for a long sunset before climbing back into the sky. In the winter, though the country never gets a full polar night with 24 hours of complete darkness, the day lasts for only a few hours. It's far enough to the north that it's a great place to see the northern lights in the winter. The entire island sits in one time zone, Greenwich Mean Time, the same time zone as the UK, Ireland, Portugal, and much of West Africa, and does not observe daylight savings. Iceland's name comes from Viking Floki Vilgerdarson, or Hrafnafloki, the first Norse settler to intentionally seek out the island. The few who'd arrived previously had found it by accident. Nadod Osvaldsson, the first Norse settler to discover the island, called it Snæland, meaning land of snow, but it was Floki's name for the island, Island, or land of ice, the origin of the English translation Iceland, that caught on back in Norway. I've often heard the story, as I'm sure you have as well, that Greenland is icy and Iceland is green, and so the names were chosen to encourage settlers to move to Greenland and discourage them from moving to Iceland, which was more habitable but already full of people. But this is only partially true. Vikings settled in Greenland over 100 years after they settled in Iceland, and primarily came from Iceland, so they would have already been familiar with the conditions there, as it was their home. Plus, the name Iceland had already been in use for a century before Vikings even knew of Greenland's existence. While the name Greenland was used in a perhaps misleading attempt to encourage settlement there, the Greenland Vikings settled in the south of the island, where today agriculture is possible, and which was even greener and warmer back then. Iceland, though it certainly has a much more hospitable climate than Greenland, does face freezing winters, and 11% of the island is covered in massive ice caps year-round. Floki's initial attempt to live on the island was not an easy one. He settled in the cold northern region of the Westfjords, and all his livestock died off after a particularly harsh winter, forcing him to return to Norway. Considering his experience, it's unsurprising that he returned speaking of a land of ice. The Old Norse name for the island, Island, remains its name in Icelandic today. Iceland has, in my opinion, a great flag. It's one of 5 countries and a number of other regions that uses a Nordic cross design, inspired by the Danish flag and spread throughout Northern Europe. Iceland's design has a red cross with a white outline on a blue field. The blue represents the country's mountains, the white its ice, and the red the fire and lava from its volcanoes. In terms of land area, Iceland is roughly in the middle of the world's countries. It takes up 39,817 square miles, or 103,125 square kilometers, making it slightly smaller than Guatemala, but larger than South Korea. If this makes it a little smaller than you imagined, as with Greenland, Iceland's northern location makes it appear larger and somewhat warped on 2D rectangular map projections, though not to as extreme a degree as its neighbor to the west. Comparing its area to US states, it's on the smaller side, roughly about the size of Kentucky or Indiana. It is, however, one of the largest islands in the world. Only 17 other islands and 21 land masses in total take up more land on the planet than Iceland. It's smaller than islands like Newfoundland and Cuba, but larger than Mindanao and the Philippines, as well as the island of Ireland. Most of the country's land area is comprised of the main island of Iceland, but it's home to dozens of smaller islands off the coast, as well as thousands of offshore rocks. The largest and most populous of the offshore islands is Heimaey, which along with a number of smaller nearby islands makes up an archipelago known as Vestmannaeyjar, or the Westman Islands. Much of the small island is taken up by a town called Vestmannaeyjabæ, which translates to Westman Islands town. Though home to just 4,300 people, it's the 5th most populous town in Iceland, outside Reykjavik and its suburbs. Other major populated islands are Hrísey in the fjord of Eyjafjörður near Akureyri, and Grímsey, located in the Arctic Circle and home to a small town called Sandvík. Home to just 372,000 people, Iceland is one of the least populous countries in the world. Only 23 other countries have a smaller population than Iceland, and none of them come anywhere near its land area. The largest country with fewer people than Iceland is Vanuatu, which has only slightly fewer residents but a land area more than 8 times smaller. With a fairly average land area but tiny population, Iceland is one of the most sparsely populated countries on the planet, the most sparsely populated in Europe, home to just 9.38 people per square mile, or 3.64 per square kilometer. Only 4 other countries, Mongolia, Western Sahara, Namibia, and Australia have a lower population density than Iceland. The inclusion of territories and autonomous regions adds only Greenland and the remote Falkland and Pitcairn Islands to the list. Even Russia and Canada, the two largest countries on the planet, each home to vast expanses of remote wilderness, are more densely populated than Iceland. Focusing in on the planet's far north, though, Iceland is actually an outlier in how large and densely populated it is relative to other regions in and just outside of the Arctic. Again, this is largely thanks to the North Atlantic Current, which brings warmer weather and keeps ports ice-free year-round. It far surpasses Greenland, Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, Yukon, and Alaska in population density. It's more than 7 times more densely populated than Alaska, which has the highest population density of any of these North American Arctic subdivisions. On top of that, Iceland's more densely populated than all but one of the 12 federal subjects of Russia that lie at a similar latitude. The areas that surpass it in population density are all in line of the North Atlantic Current, parts of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and European Russia. The country has a smaller population than every U.S. state, as well as DC and Puerto Rico, and surpasses only 3 states in population density: Montana, Wyoming, and Alaska. Iceland is geographically considered part of Europe, though not part of the European mainland, and indeed is pretty far from it. You'll sometimes hear it described as part of both Europe and North America, but this is only really the case if you're talking about tectonic plates. Iceland's location at the meeting point of the North American and Eurasian plates is incredibly important. It's the cause of the volcanic activity that has shaped the island's geography and history, but it's almost never considered the basis of what defines a continent. If that were the case, parts of California would not be part of North America, while parts of Siberia would. Iceland's connection to Europe is more of a cultural one. The country was settled by people from the European mainland over 1,000 years ago, and maintained a much closer political and economic relationship with their distant cousins in Europe than they would with North America. Though closer to the European mainland at Norway than it is to the North American mainland, the closest landmass to Iceland is the North American island of Greenland, and it's the closest European country, excluding territories, to Canada, the US, and even Mexico. It sits between 2 oceans as well, the Atlantic to the south and the Arctic to the north, more specifically the Greenland Sea. The Norwegian Sea, usually considered part of the Atlantic, is to its west, and the Denmark Strait separates it from Greenland. Its closest neighbors are Greenland, a constituent country of Denmark to the north and west, Denmark's other constituent country, the Faroe Islands, with whom it shares a number of cultural and historical ties to the southeast, and Jan Mayen, a remote volcanic island owned by Norway, which lies to the north. Past the Faroes to the southeast sits Scotland, although the Norse-influenced archipelagos of Shetland and the Hebrides lie closer than the mainland. Finally, across the Norwegian Sea to the east lies Norway, which has played an essential role in the island's history, the location from which many settlers came to the island. It shares water borders with Denmark through Greenland and the Faroe Islands, and with Norway through Jan Mayen. I don't typically go too much into the geologic history of places I cover, but with Iceland, it's essential to understanding the country's fascinating physical geography. Running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean for its entire length is an underwater string of peaks, making the longest mountain range on the planet, called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It's formed by 4 tectonic plates. East of the ridge lie the Eurasian and African plates, and west of it the North and South American plates. The ridge sits on what's known as a divergent boundary, a spot where the plates are pulling apart, the Eurasian and African plates moving generally away from the North and South American plates. At the ridge, new magma reaches the sea floor, and a long rift valley lines the inside of the mountain chain. It's responsible in part for a string of volcanic islands stretching down the center of the Atlantic, including Jan Mayen to the north of Iceland, and islands like the Azores, Ascension, St. Helena, and Tristan da Cunha further south. But Iceland is considered the only spot where the ridge fully surfaces and runs above sea level, cutting across the island from southwest to northeast. In parts of the island, the plate boundary is even starkly visible as a physical split in the earth. As well as its location on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, Iceland sits atop a hotspot, a phenomenon where large plumes of magma rise from the Earth's mantle through the crust. As tectonic plates move, the plume stays in place, creating chains of volcanic islands, the process that created Hawaii, for example. Though Iceland isn't a chain of islands, parts of Greenland, such as Disco Island, were formed by volcanic activity and are in line with the path of the hotspot. Much of its path is likely buried beneath the ice, sitting on both a major hotspot and a plate boundary. While volcanoes bring forward new land, vast glaciers and the fast-flowing rivers they feed have carved out and eroded away the landscape, cascading down from the highlands in the middle of the country to the coast in tens of thousands of spectacular waterfalls. The largest of these glaciers is Vatnajökull, the Glacier of Lakes. One of Iceland's 3 national parks, it covers a tenth of the entire country and is the second largest ice cap in all of Europe. 3 smaller but still quite large glaciers sit to the east: Longjökull, the Long Glacier, Hofsjökull, the Temple Glacier, and Mýrdalsjökull, the Glacier of the Swampy Valley. Dozens of smaller glaciers dot the mountaintops of the island. One of the most famous is Eyjafjallajökull, or the Glacier of the Island's Mountains, which was the site of a massive volcanic eruption in 2010. It isn't hard to tell where the country gets its famous nickname, the Land of Fire and Ice. All across the island you can find geysers, mud pots, hot springs, and many other spectacular volcanic features. 25% of all the island's electricity is powered by geothermal energy, as is 90% of its hot water and heating, so showers and sinks have a distinct sulfuric smell that definitely takes some getting used to. Nearly the entire country is covered in mountains, hills, and plateaus, but in the center of the country, geographic factors have rendered a region that takes up 40% of the island uninhabitable. The Icelandic Highland is a vast plateau in the interior of the island, cold, mountainous, and desolate. Lava flows have left the landscape blanketed in ash and basalt, and though it receives a decent amount of rainfall, precipitation has no soil to absorb into. Instead, rainfall seeps deep through the rocks and ash, too quickly to sustain any plant life. It functions as a desert in every way but for one important technicality. Deserts are classified based on how little rainfall they receive, and the highland has plenty of rain. It just disappears beneath the rock as soon as it falls. With its unforgiving volcanic landscape unable to support any sort of permanent population, the highland is thought to be completely uninhabited. It's easily one of the largest and most remote true wildernesses left in Europe. The ash-strewn mountainous highland and large glaciers and ice caps keep most of the Icelandic population not far from the coast, either in the city or in smaller villages and towns hugging fjords, or sitting in small fertile valleys and flatlands not far from the ocean. The west coast is dominated by 3 major peninsulas: the relatively more populous Reykjanes Peninsula to the south, not far from the city of Reykjavik, the peninsula of Snæfellsnes across the large bay of Faxaflói, home to a beautiful volcanic mountain range in one of the country's 3 national parks, and the northwestern tip of the island, the remote peninsula known as the West Fjords. The northern coast of the island is rugged as well, with bays and fjords of the Arctic Ocean cutting into the landscape, but the most jagged part of the coast besides the West Fjords is on the east, where inlets cut deep into the mountain-lined coast in an area known as the East Fjords. Much of the south coast is dominated by the enormous Vatnajökull and smaller Mýrdalsjökull, which at points sit as close as 5 miles from the Atlantic. This part of the coastline is smoother, with ash and lava rocks flowing down from the volcanoes beneath the glaciers into wide washes and gravel beds called sandur. The country is divided into 64 different municipalities, essentially local city and town governments that govern areas often well outside the urbanized areas themselves. These are further grouped together into 8 different regions for statistical, postal, and policing purposes, though the regions themselves don't have any regional governments. By far the largest in population, Höfuðborgarsvæðið, or the capital region, is home to 240,000 people, 65% of the entire country's population, but it takes up just 1% of its land at 1,046 square kilometers, less than half the size of Rhode Island. This gives it by far the highest population density in the country, 230 people per square kilometer, similar to Maryland or Delaware. It's more than 6 times the population density of the next most densely populated region. The capital region consists mostly of Reykjavik and its suburbs, home to 6 of the 10 largest cities in the country. It extends no more than a few miles outside the greater Reykjavik area, from the beginning of the Reykjanes Peninsula in the south to the fjord of Hvalfjörður off the bay of Faxaflói to the north, except for one exclave called Krýsuvík, a rural area on the southern shore of the Reykjanes Peninsula. I'll talk more about Reykjavik later on, but it's hard to overstate the city's impact on the island. About 1/3 of all Icelanders live in the city, and another 1/3 in the suburbs, leaving just about another 1/3 across the entire remainder of the island. It's also where most tourists of the island stay, and most stick pretty close to the city, visiting a string of nearby attractions billed as the Golden Circle. Because of this, while the southern and western coasts outside Reykjavik can have a pretty large tourist presence, as a general rule, the further you get from the city, the less busy and crowded it gets. Just southwest of the capital region is Suðurnes, or the Southern Peninsula, which essentially encompasses the entirety of the peninsula of Reykjanes. Suðurnes is the smallest of the country's 8 regions at just 813 square kilometers, but is in the middle in terms of population with 29,000 residents. This gives it the country's second highest population density, which at about 36 people per square kilometer is similar to Kansas. Every other Icelandic region besides it and the capital region is more sparsely populated than Wyoming, each with fewer than 2 people per square kilometer. More than half of the region's population live in the neighboring cities of Keflavik and Njarðvík, which together form a municipality called Reykjanesbæ, literally Reykjanes town. Together, they essentially make Keflavik Iceland's 5th largest city and its 3rd largest urban area, after just Reykjavik and Akureyri. Even more impressive considering it's a town of just 17,000 people. The city revolves around the Keflavik International Airport. It, and not Reykjavik, is the country's main airport. In an island nation so dominated by the tourism industry, it employs a large chunk of the population and serves an essential role as the primary point of entry in and out of the country. Other than Keflavik, the region's other main population center is Grindavik, on the south coast of the peninsula, home to about 3,300 people and the country's 7th largest urban area, until it was evacuated and partially destroyed in November of 2023 due to a nearby volcanic eruption. To the east, taking up much of Iceland's south coast, is Suðurland, or the Southern Land. It takes up a third of the island at just 31,000 square kilometers, its border cutting all the way to near the town of Stavafell to the east. The large region is Iceland's second most populous, with just around 32,000 people. The west of the region is agricultural and its population center, most residents living in the flatter, more fertile part of the region between Reykjavik and the highland, fed by rivers like the Hvítá and Iceland's longest, the Þjórsá. Its largest city, Selfoss, is the country's 8th largest and 4th largest urban area after Reykjavik, Akureyri, and Keflavik, home to around 7,500 people. Other major towns include Vestmannaeyjabæ on the Westman Islands, Höfn in the east, and smaller villages like Vík í Mýrdal, or simply Vík, near the southern tip of the island. Suðurland is home to spectacular landscapes, from the famous and dangerous black sand beaches of Reynisfjara to Skeiðarársandur, the largest of the country's sandur, or volcanic glacial washes, to Þingvellir, the country's historic seat of government, home to a spectacular fault line between the Eurasian and North American plates that today is one of the country's 3 national parks. Vatnajökull, the beautiful coastal peak of Vestrahorn, famed waterfalls like Skogafoss, Sartifoss, and Seljalandsfoss, as well as Jökulsárlón, a lagoon where icebergs calve off of Vatnajökull before floating out to sea. From Stavafell north to the town of Vopnafjörður is the region of Oystaland, the eastern land, home to just around 11,000 people. Many of its towns sit along the coast in the East Fjords, a spectacular area of mountains and fjords, home to villages like Seyðisfjörður and Reyðarfjörður. Its largest town, though, is Egilsstaðir, which sits inland between the highland and the mountains of the East Fjords in the valley of the Laugafljót River. Moving west, we reach the north coast of the island, in the region of Norðurland Eystra, the northeast, which stretches from the highland to the coast as far west as the Tröllaskagi Peninsula. It's home to 31,000 people, most of whom live in Akureyri, which, with 18,000 people, is Iceland's largest urban area outside Reykjavik, tucked along the scenic mountain-lined Eyjafjörður. In its vast highland, snow-capped peaks rise above desolate lava fields, home to the volcanic Lake Mývatn and waterfalls like Dettifoss, the most powerful in Europe. Further west, taking up the rest of the country's northern coast, is the sparsely populated Norðurland Vestra, the northwest, home to just 7,400 people, a third of whom live in the town of Sauðárkrókur, a fishing town on the fjord of Skagafjörður. Stretching to just south of the West Fjords Peninsula, it's the second least populous and the least densely populated region in the country, a desolate and beautiful stretch of mountains, valleys, and highlands along the Arctic Ocean. To its northwest juts the peninsular region of Vestfjörður, the West Fjords, which take up the entirety of the large peninsula of the same name. The Westfjords are Iceland at its most wild and remote. Just 7,200 people call this region home, a population comparable in most of the world to just a small town, although this can really be said about many Icelandic regions. More than a third of the Westfjords' population lives in a single town, Isafjordur, built on a sandspit in a Denmark Strait fjord. The town, and the region overall, is one of the most isolated in the country, at least a 4-hour drive from Isafjordur to the Ring Road, Iceland's main highway. Mountains dive dramatically into the ocean, split by stunning fjords, and tiny islands dot the bays offshore. The final Icelandic region is Vesturland, the Western Land. Taking up the west coast of the country between Reykjavik and the Westfjords, it's home to Snæfellsnes, a peninsula national park where mountains stretch into the sea, lined with small fishing villages like Grundarfjordur and Stikisholmur. The largest town, Akranes, sits on the bay of Faxaflói, south of the peninsula, and is home to 7,200 people, making it the 5th largest town outside of Greater Reykjavik, and home to almost half of Vesturland's 17,000 people. In 330 BC, a Greek explorer named Pytheas is said to have left Massalia, today Marseille in France, sailed out of the Mediterranean, and headed north. He landed on a large island, as of yet unknown to the Greeks, and explored the surrounding archipelago, calling it Britannici, from a local word, Pratani, thought to have meant the painted ones. Though his own records are lost to time, stories of Pytheas' journey spread throughout Europe upon his return, and were cited by a number of Greek and Roman historians. His name for the island would persist, although in a different form, Britain. But his discovery of Britain was not the most captivating part of his journey. See, Pytheas claimed to have kept going north, and said that he found something. After leaving the Scottish coast, he continued for 6 days, and came upon an otherworldly sight. Greek historian Strabo cites Pytheas as having seen a place, quote, where land, properly speaking, no longer exists, nor sea nor air, but a mixture of these things, like a marine lung, in which it was said that earth and water and all things are in suspension, as if this something was a link between all these elements, on which one can neither walk nor sail. Unquote. It's thought perhaps he was describing a sea now frozen with chunks of ice, a sky thick with fog. But here he found land, a place where, importantly, he claimed the sun in the summer never fully set. He called the land Thule. Some believe Pytheas made up this part of his journey, but if so, it's hard to deny that the island he claimed to have discovered fits pretty consistently with a number of lands north of mainland Europe. It's tempting to think that Pytheas' Thule might have been Iceland itself, but there's one pretty glaring problem with that theory. He claimed, after all, to have met people on the island, and Iceland, with its layers of volcanic ash making it pretty easy to date specific archaeological sites, was completely uninhabited at the time. It's possible that Pytheas made up the story altogether. Others believe he landed not on a far northern frozen island, but a northern peninsula he thought to be an island. Norway. Personally, I think this is the most plausible explanation, and it explains how he would have met people on this icy land. Regardless, though, his journey cemented in the public imagination the idea of a mysterious frozen island to the north of Britain, a concept that would captivate people and make its way onto maps for centuries to come. But there is another connection, albeit a distant one, between Pytheas' journey and the discovery of Iceland, because it's likely that the Vikings who went on to settle the island weren't the first people there, something backed up by their own sagas, the only written records we have of early Iceland. Instead, the very first people on the island probably came from one of the other lands that Pytheas brought to the attention of the Mediterranean powers, Ireland. Christianity came to the island around the year 431, and throughout the next few centuries, the Irish people converted to the religion. Many embarked on missions to mainland Europe, converting locals on the continent following the fall of Rome. Among others, a monastic tradition grew. Monks would seek isolation to pursue their faith, living as hermits or in small communities of believers. Not seeking to conquer or colonize, or even share the stories of their expeditions, they searched instead for peace and seclusion, eventually leaving their homeland altogether, taking small boats and sailing north. First to the Hebrides off the coast of Scotland, then to more and more remote archipelagos, Orkney, Shetland, the Faroe Islands. It's thought that by the 8th century, these Irish monks, perhaps using the other island chains as stepping stones, found the ultimate place of isolation, a stunning remote landmass, carved by the violent forces of the earth, sea, and sky, possibly never sighted before by human eyes. For the next 100 or so years, these small monastic communities would inhabit Iceland in peace. Though there's no archaeological evidence of these Irish monks, who the Vikings called the Popar, living on the island, there is proof that they settled on at least the archipelagos of Orkney and Shetland. And the combination of a number of Icelandic place names being traced back to the Popar, as well as testimony from early Viking settlers of their presence, makes it a strong possibility. On top of that, a number of crosses carved into caves in southern Iceland have a stylistic resemblance to similar carvings in Britain and Ireland. In 794, back in Britain, on a small island off the English coast called Lindisfarne, the Church of St. Cuthbert was suddenly attacked in a brutal and bloody raid by ships from the north. Though not the first raid, it marks the beginning of the Viking Age. Out of Scandinavia, a people known as the Norse began launching expeditions across Europe. They came from what is now Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Some were what we think of as Vikings, pirates, pillagers who launched raids and terrorized towns across the continent. Many were also merchants, operating trade routes that stretched into Russia and the Middle East. On top of that, they were colonists, successfully conquering much of eastern England. Parts of Scotland and Ireland came under their control. Normandy in France and its people, the Normans, take their name from their ancestors, these Viking Northmen who conquered it, and Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine are each cultural offshoots of an ancient Viking kingdom in Eastern Europe. It was the British Isles, however, that were arguably the most impacted, and the most consistent target of Viking expansion, except of course for Iceland, their most successful colony. Shetland and then Orkney were the first places colonized by the Norse, and from there they were able to sail, plunder, and settle throughout the British Isles. The Celtic peoples living within the lands they conquered were at times kidnapped and enslaved, while in other cases the Norse settlers assimilated into their society. Today, Shetland and Orkney are dominated by a fusion of Norse and Celtic culture. These early islands the Norse conquered, remember, had been home already to Popar, the Irish monks who likely settled as far north as Iceland. It's possible that while on Shetland, Orkney, or the Faroes, these new settlers heard tales from their Celtic inhabitants of a great northern island and followed their path north. It's just as likely, though, that like the Irish monks, these skilled seafarers came upon the island by accident. Again, we have to count on the Icelandic sagas for the country's early history, because for centuries these stories were passed down orally before eventually being transcribed. Dates at times are probably not exact, and certainly myths and embellishments have made their way in. At the same time, these works, like the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlement, and the Íslendingabók, the Book of the Icelanders, are still very useful to help us understand the very early days of Norse Iceland. As the sagas tell it, the Norse discovered Iceland with the voyage of a man named Nadod Ásvaldsson. Nadod, who came from Norway, was a settler on the Faroe Islands, and in the middle of the 9th century, the year traditionally given is 861, he was returning to Norway when his ship was blown off course, all the way to the east coast of Iceland. Landing near what is now the East Fjords town of Reyðarfjörður, Nadod called the island Snælund, the land of snow. He stayed in Snælund for just about a year before heading home to the Faroes, where he spread the word of his accidental find. Though Nadod had no desire to settle in this land of snow, others did. A Viking from Sweden named Garðar Sverrisson, like Nadod, found it after being blown off course as well, this time sailing around and exploring the entire coast of the island, which he called Garðarsólmur, Garðar's little island. Word of Garðar's journey made it to a man named Floki Vilgerdarsson, or Hrafna Floki, who became the first Norseman to seek out the island intentionally and find it. He settled in the West Fjords, but cold winters killed off his herds, and he went back to Norway. With him, he brought a name for this new island, one that would stick: Ísland, the land of ice. The first Norse expedition to successfully settle on the island, though, was Ingolfur Arnarsson, who left Norway with his family and Irish slaves. In 874, the year that traditionally begins the Icelandic Age of Settlement, Ingolfur settled at a site he named the Bay of Smokes, Reykjavik. For most of Iceland's history, it would remain nothing more than a rural homestead. The fact that the site of Iceland's first permanent home would eventually become its capital and only major city was a complete coincidence. Back in Norway, massive political change was underway. Harald Fairhair, the ruler of a small kingdom in the southeastern region of the Vestfold, had begun conquering and consolidating power over other kingdoms, creating for the first time a unified Norway. But with this unification came political upheaval in the new country. Chieftains, kings, and other powerful families now under Harald's rule fled west to this newly discovered island, escaping the Norwegian crown. From around 870, lasting just 60 years to 930, some roughly 10 to 30,000 settlers followed Ingolfr to the island, in what was known in Iceland as the Age of Settlement. By the end of those 6 decades, the island was full, and the settlers practically halted their arrival. This probably seems to make little sense. How could this huge island, whose population has increased at least tenfold since then, have been unable to contain a larger population at the time? I've referred to many Norse settlements outside of Scandinavia as colonies, and in many ways they were. Norse settlers transplanted there and in many instances took control over the local population. But in other ways, they, and Iceland in particular, were very different from, say, later British settler colonies in North America. Often they were entirely separate political entities. Ingolfr landed in Iceland a good decade before a country called Norway even existed, and it would remain politically independent from it for centuries. While Viking trade routes were quite lucrative for rulers back in Scandinavia, Iceland itself was not seen at the time as being rich in resources for exploitation. And to top it off, there was no indigenous population on the island, no towns to raid or kingdoms to trade with. There was little at the time that Norway wanted from Iceland. Nothing to ship out and trade with the mother country, and because of that, there was no reason for cities and towns to develop at all. Those that came to the island just wanted to live out from under the thumb of Norway. They wanted land to survive off of, and they gobbled it up fast. Settlers pretty much lived off the land, taking as much territory as they could farm, and establishing rural homesteads that were more or less self-sufficient and separate from one another. They arrived on an island covered in forest, but to make way for farmland, to build ships and houses, and fuel fires, they deforested the entire island incredibly quickly, and even today, only a tiny proportion of the island contains trees. It's unsurprising that on an island with so much rough and uninhabitable terrain, arable land ran out pretty quickly, and after that, there was really no reason anyone would want to move there. The promise of a place to live and a way to make a living has always been a major pull factor for migration, and without it, Iceland has never since experienced a major influx of people, something rare for any country. On top of that, Iceland was, save for the Papar, uninhabited when the settlers arrived. Very few people were there before, and very few have come since. This means that Icelanders are, for the most part, all descendants of the same founding population that arrived in a very short period of time, and no one else. There was even famously a dating app made to make sure potential lovers aren't too closely related. But this era of settlement, the beginning of the Icelandic nation, is the easy part. Who these first Icelanders were is a little trickier. See, Icelanders very much conceive of themselves as Norse, as descendants of these Viking explorers. They use a Nordic cross flag. They use the patronymic naming system the Norse used, sons and daughters having the suffix son or dóttir added to their father's first name to create their surname. While over time the Norse in Scandinavia split into a number of distinct cultures and ethnic groups, and Old Norse evolved into separate languages like Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, in Iceland the language remained pretty much unchanged. They came to call it Íslenska, or Icelandic, but Icelanders pretty much speak Old Norse. Anyone fluent in Icelandic can understand Old Norse text quite well, whereas speakers of Norwegian or other Nordic languages would have a lot more trouble. And these texts themselves, these sagas, provide not only an early history of Iceland, but a national origin story, a semi-mythologized Viking past, daring tales of exploration and adventure. And these sagas speak mostly of Norse settlers who came from Norway. But because Iceland's population can be traced back almost entirely to the Age of Settlement, DNA tests are pretty informative about who these settlers were. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down from the mother, can paint a picture of Iceland's first female inhabitants, while Y chromosomes, passed down from the father, can give us information about its first male settlers. What have they found? According to DNA testing, 80% of early Icelandic men came from Norway, the other 20% from Ireland and Scotland. Look at women, and the Norwegian population is down to 37%, while the other 2/3, again, are from Ireland and Scotland. When it's all said and done, it paints a picture not of a homogeneous population from Norway alone, but a people born from two distinct cultures, some 60% Norse from Norway, the other 40% Celtic from Ireland and Scotland. These are not the Papar, the Irish monks who predated the Norse settlers left when the Vikings arrived en masse. Losing not only their solitude, but now sharing the land with pagans, these early Icelanders worshipped Norse gods like Thor and Odin. They set sail and tried their monastic life elsewhere. It's possible that some of this Celtic heritage can be attributed to settlers from other Norse colonies. Though many of Iceland's early settlers came from Norway, particularly its west coast, many also came from Norse settlements in places like Britain and Ireland, Shetland, Orkney, the Faroes, the Hebrides, and so on, and likely established families there with local Celtic populations. For the most part, the answer to the huge disparity between the proportions of Celtic men and women in early Iceland is slavery. Wealthy Norse families frequently arrived on the island with slaves, who they called thralls. Most were captured and traded from raids in the British Isles, kidnapped by Vikings in these brutal attacks, and brought eventually to Iceland. Many were forced into manual labor. What's clear too from the DNA results is that most were women, often forced into marriage or to become concubines by their captors. As most of the Norse settlers who arrived were men, many took enslaved Celtic women from Ireland and Scotland as wives, and much of the first generation born on the island had both Norse and Celtic heritage. A number of Celtic people moved to Iceland voluntarily as settlers as well. The Celtic and Norse populations mixed pretty quickly, while culturally in this Norse-dominated society, it was the Norse influences that prevailed and were passed down. Although some researchers believe that the Icelandic language contains some Gaelic influences, it is for the most part a very similar language to Old Norse, as is the language of the Faroe Islands, Faroese, which, like Iceland, were settled primarily by men from Norway and women from Ireland. Slavery in the island ended altogether in the 12th century. Similarly to what would happen in the United States, many Icelanders had moved to the island for political reasons. Opposition to the King of Norway and his territorial expansion into their lands in western Norway, and as such they were generally not interested in conquering one another or subjecting the whole island to their rule. They even, for the most part, stopped launching Viking raids. Generally, they were interested in farming and being left alone. Chieftains gained power on the island, but drew their power from farmers, who were free to switch allegiance, and as such, no chieftain became too powerful. But conflicts did occur, and eventually the need for a way to settle disputes became clear. In the year 930, chieftains from across the island met at Þingvellir, the plain where the tectonic plates meet and create such stunning cliffs and ravines, and formed the Alþingi, a council to deliberate on issues that would become one of the world's first parliaments. Though loosely organized and not always effective at keeping the peace, Iceland had a government. It was now a unified country, and over a millennium ago, a democracy at that. Viking raids from Iceland had essentially ended, but trade and exploration continued. In 960, a relative of Nadod, the first Norseman to set eyes on the island, named Thorvaldir Osvaldsson, was charged with several murders and exiled from Norway. He fled to Iceland and brought with him his family, including his 10-year-old son, Eiríkur, who would become better known as Eric the Red. Eric grew up in Iceland, but as an adult would have no better temper than his father. 22 years after his father's banishment, Eric kept the family tradition alive and was too banished for several murders. Eric again fled west with his family, including his Icelandic-born son, Leif. Eric did not, as it is commonly believed, accidentally stumble upon Greenland. Icelanders had been aware of the island's existence at least since a man named Gunnbjörn Ulfsson did indeed find it after being blown off course, and other Icelandic Vikings had sailed to it since. Eric was probably aware of Greenland's existence and likely sought it out intentionally. There he gave the island its name, probably somewhat misleadingly, although the area he settled in the south was fairly green and warmer at the time. Coming back to Iceland to recruit settlers, he returned with several ships, founding the so-called eastern and western settlements, Norse colonies on the west coast and southern tip of the island. From there, his son Leif and other Greenland Vikings would venture south, sighting the North American mainland and founding colonies at least as far south as Newfoundland, where a site, Landsaw Meadows, has been uncovered, thought perhaps to be a staging point for further expeditions. The North American colony did not survive, and the Greenland colony, though more successful, died off after a few centuries, unbeknownst to Iceland or Norway. But by nearly a half century, whether you count the North American island of Greenland or the mainland of the continent itself, it wasn't the Spanish, British, French, or Portuguese, but the Icelanders that would become the first Europeans to reach the Americas. By the end of the 10th century, Christianity had been the dominant religion in Europe for several centuries, mostly in the remnants of the Roman Empire, but was beginning to make a foothold in Scandinavia as Viking merchants traded with Christians throughout other parts of Europe, converted and brought their faith back with them. In Norway, King Olaf I converted to Christianity and made it his ambition to convert, often forcibly, the country to his new faith. During his reign, a number of missionaries arrived on the island, both from Norway and from other parts of Europe, and by the year 1000, it had made a foothold in Iceland. The chieftains of the island were divided between Christianity and their traditional pagan Norse faith, and that year the Alþingi voted to adopt Christianity, cementing it as the country's official religion. In the next few centuries, Norway had grown into a strong empire. Though Harald and a number of other kings struggled with rebellious chieftains, his successors eventually cemented their rule over the country and the island territories the Norse had conquered and colonized, like Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, Faroes, and the Isle of Man. In the 13th century, Norwegian King Håkon IV set his sights on an even bigger prize, Iceland. After all, many of its settlers had come from Norway. They spoke similar languages, once the same, but at this point beginning to split into distinct dialects, and were highly dependent on Norway for trade. Håkon gained influence with a number of powerful chieftains, while at the same time, violence between warring factions on the island had stirred chaos that played to Norway's advantages. Though the Alþingi had been established to settle disagreements and keep chieftains from gaining too much power, by this point a few families had managed to take control of much of the island, and battled one another for control, what's been called the Age of the Sturlungs, after the most powerful of these families. Håkon portrayed himself as a peacemaker, wanting to end the strife gripping Iceland, and by 1262, just 1 year before his death, his influence campaign was successful. Without any war or invasion, he had conquered Iceland. The long independent Commonwealth, one of the country's first parliamentary democracies, was now a territory of a foreign monarchy. The Icelanders were for the first time under the political will of their distant cousins, whose rule they had fled 4 centuries prior. With it came another prize, which the Icelanders had initially settled, but which had also functioned as independent Greenland. Norway was now a true empire, stretching across the North Atlantic, linked by trade routes bridging the seas between their expansive island territories. Through marriage between the royal families, the thrones of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had made their way into the hands of the same family, and in 1397 they were unified into one country, called the Kalmar Union. Each maintained a degree of autonomy, and acted for the most part as equal partners, but now Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and all of Norway's overseas territories, including Iceland, were one country. In 1521, Sweden successfully secured its independence, ending the Union, and Norway tried to follow suit. In 1537, Denmark made clear that an independent Norway was not an option, invading and annexing their northern neighbor. They called it Denmark-Norway, but in reality Norway was a subject of Denmark, and would remain so until the Napoleonic Wars. The wars placed Sweden and Denmark on opposite sides of the conflict, and in 1814, the Treaty of Kiel handed Norway over to Sweden, while Denmark kept control of Norway's 3 remaining territories, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland, even though no one had reached the Greenland colonies in 400 years, during which the Norse settlements there had completely died out. These centuries and centuries of European politics, wars, and territorial changes had relatively little impact on day-to-day life in Iceland, but resulted in its transformation from an independent country to a subject of Norway, and finally to a Danish colony. It was economics, religion, and natural disasters that would have the biggest impact on Iceland throughout these years. Under Norwegian rule, the Alþingi survived, though as a secondary government, and many Icelanders were appointed to local government positions. Under the Kalmar Union, trade ramped up when Norwegian merchants realized the value of Iceland's fisheries, but they were followed by English merchants who railed against any restrictions and exercised de facto economic control over the island for much of the 1400s, what Icelanders call the English Century. English merchants even went so far as to kill the governor of Iceland. German trade followed, but by 1602, Denmark cut Iceland off from the outside world. Trade could only be with Denmark. If you've seen my Greenland video, you might remember that they were subject to the same stringent trade monopoly, though in Iceland it only lasted until 1855, nearly a century before Greenland was opened up to the rest of the world. In 1627, in what Icelanders called the Turkish abductions, though Turkey had nothing to do with it, pirates from what is now Algeria raided coastal towns in Iceland, captured about 400 people, and sold them into slavery in North Africa, though some made it out and returned. Natural disasters and disease wreaked havoc on the island. In the 1400s, 2 bouts of the bubonic plague halved the country's population and kept Iceland a sparsely populated agricultural society. But in this land born from fire, Iceland too has been rocked by disastrous volcanic eruptions. In 1783, Loki, a volcano in southern Iceland, erupted, but Loki's eruption itself was only the beginning. Over the next few months, a mist seemed to settle over Iceland. In this haze, the animals began to die. Horses, cattle, sheep, the livestock Icelanders depended on for food. 80% of Iceland's sheep dropped dead, and half its horses and cattle. Without food, Iceland's people began to perish too. A quarter of the Iceland died in what they called the mist hardships, or the haze famine. This mist, sulfur and fluorine gas, which continued to spew out of Loki's fissures for 8 months after the eruption. Across the world, Loki's eruption impacted the weather. The Mississippi River froze in New Orleans. Drought set in India. A cold winter in Britain's war-torn North American colonies held up representatives traveling to sign the Treaty of Paris, and delayed the official independence of the United States. In France, freezing temperatures would bring food shortages, famine, and rising bread prices. The French Revolution would ensue. In 1875, another devastating eruption in the eastern volcano of Oskia came at a time when steamships were beginning to cross the Atlantic. Again, famine set in. But this time, many Icelanders were able to flee. As were many Europeans at the time, most went to North America, but while a large number did settle in the United States, the majority went to Canada. About 14,000 Icelanders left the country. This doesn't seem like much, but it was a fifth of Iceland's entire population at the time. Today, their descendants live mostly in Canada and the US, about 100,000 and 50,000 respectively. One of the largest destinations was a region on the southern part of Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba, which they called New Iceland. They founded a town there called Gimli, that today is home to the largest Icelandic population outside of Iceland itself. More eruptions would come. Katla extended the coastline by 3 miles in 1918, and eruptions in the Westman Islands created a new island, Surtsey, in 1963, and a decade later, a new volcano, Eldfell, on the main island, nearly destroying the main town of Vestmannaeyjabæ, before locals were astonishingly able to halt the lava flows by pumping water from the ocean on top of it. Of course, very recently, in 2023 and 2024, the year I'm writing this video, eruptions near Grindavik partially destroyed the town and forced its evacuation. It's still unclear whether it will be able to ultimately return. By the mid-1700s, Iceland was still entirely rural. Today, it reports that 94% of its population lives in urban areas, while only 6% live in rural areas. A standard, however, that classifies any town with more than 200 residents as urban. If you use a higher standard, like 2,500, the cutoff used by a number of other countries, it would be more like 75%. Still a sharp change from the entirely rural island that Iceland was for the first near 1,000 years since the settlement. Even the capital, the site at which the government met, was not a city or even a town, but Þingvellir, a rift valley that would become a national park. The parliament met outside, sitting on the rocks. Urbanization began with the rise of industry in the island and grew as Iceland industrialized. At first, on an island with more sheep than people, industry was wool production. A Danish man named Skuli Magnusson built wool factories at a site on the bay of Faxaflói, the same spot Iceland's first successful Norse settler had landed and built his homestead. His name for the spot, even 1,000 years later, remained the Bay of Smokes, Reykjavik. The wool factory didn't go too far, but it brought people to the site and helped attract the trading charter. As Denmark began opening Iceland up from its trade monopoly, the small town began to develop a port, and a revival of local government brought back the Alþingi, this time moving it from its long-standing outdoor venue of Þingvellir to this new bustling little port town. Reykjavik would only continue to grow, and the rise of commercial fishing would bring Icelanders from the farms out to coastal fishing villages. Not just in Reykjavik, but across the island, Iceland was urbanizing, even if much of that urbanization was movement from individual family farms to tiny villages. With a rapidly urbanizing society came social change. Throughout the 1800s, Icelanders began pushing for independence from Denmark, led by nationalist leaders like Jón Sigurðsson. Denmark returned local government in 1845, only with the power of advising the Danish king. However, a constitution came in 1874 and home rule in 1904. Similar to how Greenland and the Faroe Islands are today, Iceland remained a part of Denmark, but functioned with significant autonomy. By 1918, it came very close to full independence with the Act of Union. The island was declared to be an independent monarchy, called the Kingdom of Iceland, with the Danish monarch as its ruler. For the most part, Iceland would govern itself, but Denmark would still represent it on the global stage, as well as handle its foreign policy and defense. Another part of the Act of Union, by the end of 1940, the act would be renegotiated. Failure to find an agreement would mean an end of the Union and a fully independent Iceland. But negotiation of a new treaty would be the last of the country's problems. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, launching the Second World War. Hitler's troops marched north into Denmark less than a year later, in April of 1940, and occupied their northern neighbor, until their defeat 5 years later. Not wanting Iceland to fall under German control, British troops moved in to defend the island. The Icelandic government wanted to stay neutral and considered it an invasion, but did essentially nothing to stop it. The next year, they were replaced by American forces. With Denmark under German control and unable to defend the island, Iceland decided it was time to end the Union and achieve full independence. In May of 1944, the country held an independence referendum, and 98.4% of voters turned out. 99.5% voted to end the union with Denmark. On June 17, 1944, independence leader Jon Sigurdsson's birthday, the Alþingi ceremonially met at their historic meeting place of Þingvellir and severed the Act of Union. Iceland, for the first time since Norway took over 682 years prior, was fully independent once more. The young republic has changed significantly in the 8 decades since independence. In 1974, the country completed Highway 1, the Ring Road, linking cities and towns throughout Iceland with a single highway. The Sandur in the south of the island had been difficult to travel across, and it was near impossible to drive across parts of the south coast, meaning that travelers would have to drive the other direction around the entire island to reach towns that were very close as the crow flies. In 1980, Icelanders elected a woman named Vigdís Finnbogadóttir to the presidency. Not only was she Iceland's first female president, but she's thought to be the first woman ever to be democratically elected head of state in the world. Serving 16 years in office, to this day she remains the world's longest serving female president as well. During the early 2000s, Icelandic banks grew massive with significant international expansion, but the 2008 Great Recession caused all 3 main banks to completely collapse, devastating the Icelandic economy. Within 3 years, their currency, the krona's value, halved, and the country plunged into economic chaos. Major protests erupted, and the government cracked down on the bankers, the Supreme Court sentencing 39 of them to prison for their role in the meltdown. The country's eventual economic recovery was thanks in large part to a major shift in the tourism industry. Interestingly enough, it was a major natural disaster that sparked this economic transition. In 2010, Eyjafjallajökull, a volcano covered by an ice cap near the southern city of Vík, erupted. The eruption sent a massive cloud of ash into the sky, covering most of Europe. It shut down most flights to or from Europe for a week, in some cases up to 5 weeks. 108,000 flights, 48% of all global air traffic, were canceled. With about 500,000 visitors a year, Iceland was not a huge tourism destination to begin with, and numbers had already been dropping due to the financial crisis. Most of the country's population worked in the fishing industry. The eruption was bad publicity for Iceland, and a consulting firm hired by the country found that negative views of Iceland globally skyrocketed in its immediate aftermath. But with all the bad publicity, Iceland was getting a lot more attention than usual, and they embarked on a major advertising campaign encouraging people to visit the island. In that sense, the eruption was flipped on its head and turned into an asset, a symbol of the country's stunning physical setting. In the next few years, tourism numbers would quadruple. In 2023, 2.2 million people visited the country of just 372,000. In 2017, it clocked in at 6,600 international tourists per 1,000 people living on the island, meaning in a given year, there will have been more than 6 times the number of tourists in Iceland than full-time residents. For comparison, there were only about 25% as many international tourists to the United States that same year as there were people living in the US. Even France, which in terms of sheer numbers is the world's most visited tourist destination, had nowhere near as many tourists per capita as Iceland. Tourist arrivals surpassing the French population by about 30% compared to 660% for Iceland. No country has more tourists per capita than Iceland, and its impact is staggering. It makes up a third of the country's GDP, by far its largest economic sector. Either directly or indirectly, much of the country relies on tourist dollars, and its presence is visible everywhere. Through not only the numerous tourist shops and the flocks of visitors at Iceland's waterfalls, hot springs, and glaciers, but perhaps most tellingly, the presence of the English language. Though practically everyone speaks Icelandic fluently as their mother tongue, as the primary language of the UK and its former colonies like the US, English has become the dominant language of international business and a common second language learned by people around the world. It's taught in schools in Iceland, and 98% of the population speaks it, mostly as a second language, and many quite fluently, especially those working in the tourism industry. Danish, the language of Iceland's former colonial ruler, is also taught and widely understood on the island, although practically everyone speaks Icelandic as their mother tongue. Especially in Reykjavik, the epicenter of tourism to the island, businesses and signs are often in English, catering to visitors. By far Iceland's largest and really only major city, about a third of the country's population lives within its city limits, and another third within its suburbs. The city sits in southwestern Iceland, on a peninsula jutting out into the Bay of Faxaflói, just north of the peninsula of Reykjanes. Its suburbs sprawl along the shores of the bay, up into the hills to its south and east, and along smaller nearby peninsulas. Off the shore, small islands dot the coastline. Save for the city of Nuuk in neighboring Greenland, which as of yet is not an independent country, Reykjavik is the northernmost national capital city on the planet, at 64 degrees north of the equator, just 2 below the Arctic Circle. It's hard to overstate how far Reykjavik is from any other major city. It's a small city, with about 240,000 in the entire capital region, but for Iceland this is massive. Outside of its suburbs and the smaller northern port town of Akureyri, every other settlement in the country can only really be described as a village. Iceland's closest neighbors, Greenland and the Faroe Islands, have no cities even remotely as large as Reykjavik. In fact, if you map every city in the world with more than 100,000 people, the closest to Reykjavik is the Scottish city of Aberdeen, more than 800 miles or 1,300 kilometers away. By this definition, it's the fourth most remote city of its size on the planet, surpassed only by Honolulu, Anchorage, and the Australian city of Perth. My brother Quinn and I had the privilege of traveling to Iceland last summer. We drove the ring road around the island, but spent a few days before and after in what is truly an incredible city. Downtown is nestled between a small lake called Tjörnin and the city's port, home to the iconic Harpa concert hall. Mountains hem in the bay on the other side. The Althingi meets in a small parliament building off of a small square right in the heart of the city. Downtown itself is tiny, only a few blocks across. Pedestrian walkways and tight roads cutting through more densely packed development that still rarely reaches more than 4 stories tall. It gets residential pretty quick outside of downtown. Like many cities near the Arctic, many of Reykjavik's houses are brightly colored, giving you views of a gorgeous cityscape down the most random residential streets. Many are covered in sheets of corrugated iron, a relic of the early 1900s, after a fire spared such homes and led the city for a while to require them in building codes, giving the city a really unique architectural feel. Further from the city center, you start to see larger block-style apartment complexes and more modern high-rises. As is often the case in Europe, the tallest buildings in Reykjavik are often outside of downtown, mostly along the bay. The tallest building in the country, Smáratorg, isn't even located in the city, but in the southern suburb of Kópavogur. Iceland's second tallest is Hallgrímskirkja, a somber, almost gloomy yet strikingly beautiful cathedral sitting atop a hill in the east of the city. Some of the city's main business arteries run to the city's east. The shopping and entertainment quarter of Laugavegur and Skálavíkurstigur, the colorful Rainbow Road. On the water sits the Höfði House, where Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev held a 1986 summit attempting to work towards nuclear arms control. On top of a hill overlooking the city, the Perlan is a great Icelandic natural history museum built on top of 6 water tanks. While tourist spots like the Blue Lagoon get lots of attention, the city's home to a number of geothermal public baths that are often popular local hangouts and great places to relax. Icelandic food, unsurprisingly, uses a lot of sheep and fish, and has a reputation of tasting pretty bad to the foreign palate. Things like dried fish, fish paste that's eaten on bread, and perhaps most infamously hálkuk, Greenland shark meat that has been buried in the ground to rot and then hung out to dry in a month-long process that rids the meat of its poisonous quality, though if you taste it, you might not be convinced. The best way to honestly describe the taste is like ammonia, and the aftertaste can last with you for a while. So if you're in Iceland and you see what looks like little cubes of cheese, don't say I didn't warn you. Perhaps that's why Brennivín, a liquor made from caraway with a really distinctive and hard-to-place taste, is so popular there. Iceland was under partial prohibition until 1989. Funnily enough, beer was the last drink to be banned, and even today it's pretty strict. Any drink with a percentage of more than 2.5% has to be bought in state-run shops called Vínbúðins. I personally really enjoyed a beer called Gosi, which was made from a style of Icelandic yogurt called skyr. I have no idea if this is a traditional drink or if just some wild creation, or if they're even still in business, and I can't find anything about it online, so if any Icelanders are watching, let me know. One food Iceland does really well is, funnily enough, the hot dog, which they call the pilsur or pulsar. Supposedly the pronunciation is up for dispute. Their really delicious version of the hot dog has a frank itself made from lamb, pork, and beef, fried onions, raw onions, and 3 sauces like ketchup, remoulade, and sweet mustard. Absolutely delicious and definitely worth a try. The supermarket Bonus is everywhere throughout the country, as well as a number of international brands. Sparrow, the American pizza chain that's usually in airports and malls, is seemingly pretty popular there, with quite a few locations on the island. As Reykjavik has the country's busiest port, a major industrial fishing and shipping hub, as well as a cruise port of call that brings in lots of tourists, and with Keflavik, home to Iceland's busiest airport, just 45 minutes from town, it's where most of the millions of tourists who come to Iceland each year stay. The country even pitches the so-called Golden Circle of destinations not far outside the city, and many visitors spending just a few days in the country fly in, stay in Reykjavik, and visit Golden Circle spots like Þingvellir, the Blue Lagoon, Geysir, a geothermal area that lent its name to the geyser, and waterfalls like Gullfoss, often as part of a travel package. Because of this, the southwest of the island is typically the most jam-packed with tourists. The further you go out on the Ring Road, you can find some places that are pretty remote and quiet. The country's rural areas are simply wonderful. Sheep, goats, and horses graze beautiful green pastures. Small villages around the beautiful churches, fishing harbors, and colorful houses, all on a backdrop of green and yellow meadows, white mountains, black lava fields, purple blooms of lupine, and tiny islands dotting the coast. Here, the earth feels alive, from the second you touch down on the tarmac and see the cracks and flakes in the landscape. Of course, there are the stunning mountain vistas, the glaciers calving out into sea, the beaches of black sand, the thundering waterfalls with walls of mist rising from the base, drenching any onlooker. There are the geysers and sulfuric stench of mud pits and fumaroles, the rare pseudo-craters where lava flowing over swamps and lakes caused gas explosions that riddled the landscape with cones and craters, the fissures in the earth where tectonic plates meet so vividly, the coastal puffin colonies, the grass-thatched roofs in the style of the people who came long before, and of course, the desolate stretches of land. Not a human being in sight, where you could easily mistake yourself for being on the surface of another planet altogether. The roads that quickly give way to gravel and dirt. The drives along cliff faces with a vast, cold, and empty sea far, far below. Now I'll pass it to Haker, a fan of the channel from Iceland, to talk about life on the island.
Hi, I'm an Icelandic person. I live in Iceland and I've lived here for 20 years. Because that's how old I am and I've never lived in a different country. Well, that will change one day. I would say Iceland. This country is awesome. This country is awesome. It's really nice here, but it's also really cold. It's called Iceland for a goddamn reason. It's really cold and it's really windy, I've heard. I've had Americans come over here and they're like, dude, you guys are getting like hurricane-like winds. And I'm just like, that's not a hurricane, that's just really windy. So, yeah, in all essence, it's really windy, it's really cold, it's also really rainy. After having lived here my whole life, it's like, you forget how far north up you actually are. Living here is really nice. Living here is really expensive. Living here is super expensive. Everything is super expensive. I've had people, especially Americans, because like I get a lot of Americans who are friends of mine, family members, and they're like, dude, it's so goddamn expensive here. It's so expensive. And like the cost of living too. This country is full of natural beauty. Lots of natural beauty. And camping here is awesome. And the people usually pretty nice. And pretty inclusive society. I would say I like living here, but I don't want to live here forever, and I plan on moving to the States one day, as a matter of fact. I want to go somewhere down south, where there's actually sun. During the winter, we get basically no sun. The sun only rises for like a few hours at a time during the winter months, essentially. But yeah, essentially, I like living here, and it's awesome.
That's it for Iceland. Please go check out my other videos in The Nation Explained on Ukraine and Iceland's neighbor to the west, Greenland. If you enjoyed this video, I'd recommend watching my series in the states of the United States, The US Explained, and my 2-part regional breakdown on the US. Please go check out my brother's video on our time in Iceland at Quinn the Cameraman. If you want to learn more about bits of Icelandic history, I've attached some of the names of and links to various papers I read for this video in the description. Remember to sign up for a 14-day free trial with MyHeritage using this link or by scanning the QR code on the screen. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.